The judge laughed. Not a small laugh. Not the kind you hide behind a hand. He leaned back in his chair and let it out, full and open, and the sound bounced off the wood-paneled walls of Courtroom 4 in the Ontario Superior Court of Justice, like it belonged there. Zola Adeyinka didn't flinch. She stood at the respondent's table in a blazer she'd borrowed from her cousin. Too wide in the shoulders, the sleeves just a little too short, holding a manila folder so thick the edges had started to curl. She was 23 years old. She had no law degree, no articling experience, no bar admission. She had 2 years of Canadian Forces service, 1 tour in Latvia, with NATO's enhanced forward presence, and a grandmother who was about to lose the only home she had ever owned. That was enough. Let me tell you something before we go any further. The people in that courtroom, the lawyers, the clerks, the court reporter with her stenography machine, they all saw a young woman in an ill-fitting jacket, standing where a licensed barrister should have stood. They saw someone who didn't belong, and every single one of them was wrong. Her grandmother, Mavis Adeyinka, sat beside her in a straight-backed chair, her hands folded on top of a brown leather purse she'd owned since 1987. Mavis was 78. She had lived in her house on Elm Ridge Crescent in Brampton since 1991. The year she arrived from Accra with 2 suitcases and a determination that her children would grow up with a yard. She had paid off the mortgage in 2009. She had the papers to prove it. None of that mattered to the man on the other side of the courtroom. His name was Owen Prescott, 44, silver hair, a navy suit that cost more than Mavis's monthly pension. He sat with the practiced stillness of someone who had won so many times he had stopped being surprised by it. His lawyer, a compact woman named Judith Bale, was already shuffling papers with the quiet confidence of someone who knew the outcome before the hearing started. Prescott claimed he had purchased Mavis's home 18 months earlier. He had a signed agreement of purchase and sale. He had a notarized transfer of title. He had a lawyer who had processed the paperwork. He had everything. The problem, the only problem, from his perspective, was that Mavis had never sold him her house. Zola had been in Kandahar when her grandmother first called her. That's not right. She'd been in a forward operating base 40 kilometers south of Kandahar, in a signals intelligence unit that she still couldn't discuss in full detail, doing work she was extraordinarily good at. She had a gift for patterns, for finding the thing that didn't fit. Her commanding officer, a man who had served 3 tours himself, once told her she could find a forged number in a spreadsheet the way a dog finds a bone. He meant it as a compliment. She took it as one. She came home on a compassionate leave extension in October, 2 years before the court date, when Mavis had a mild stroke. Not serious, the doctor said, but at 76, nothing was nothing. Zola came home and found her grandmother sitting at the kitchen table in the house on Elm Ridge, going through a stack of mail with a magnifying glass. She found bills she didn't recognize. She found a letter from a company she'd never heard of, referencing a payment schedule she hadn't agreed to. She found at the bottom of the pile a notice from the City of Peel region addressed not to Mavis Adeyinka, but to Owen Prescott Properties Limited. "Grandma," Zola said very quietly, "who is Owen Prescott?" Mavis looked up. Her left hand still trembled slightly from the stroke. "He came to the door," she said. "He was very nice. He said he was from the government. He wasn't from the government. What Prescott had done, what his operation specialized in, as Zola would later discover, was targeting elderly homeowners. Not with violence, not with anything obvious. He had a system. He would approach, offer to help with deferred property taxes or home equity paperwork, present documents with a great deal of confident authority, and guide the signature to the right line. The homes he targeted were usually owned outright, by people who had paid them off over decades, people who didn't have adult children nearby, people who trusted paper. He had done it 9 times in the Greater Toronto area before he found Mavis Adeyinka. He was expecting it to go just like the others. He had not accounted for her granddaughter. The first lawyer Zola called quoted her $8,000 as a retainer. The second quoted 11. The third was a legal aid clinic that put her on a waiting list and told her the estimated processing time was 14 weeks. The hearing was in 6. She sat in the kitchen of the house on Elm Ridge with her grandmother's documents spread across the table, and her own military-issue laptop open beside them. She had been out of the forces for 4 months. She didn't have $8,000. She had a part-time job at a fitness facility in Mississauga, and a small, clean apartment she was still furnishing. She had, as she later told a friend, exactly nothing to lose. She read the Ontario Rules of Civil Procedure for the first time on a Wednesday night in March. She read them again on Thursday. She found the section on self-represented litigants. She found the case law on fraudulent conveyance. She found a retired paralegal named Ronald Briggs through a community legal clinic in Brampton, a man who was not licensed to represent her, but who could, legally, advise. And she called him at 8 in the morning on a Friday. He picked up on the second ring. "You're going to need to find the original execution date on that transfer of title," he told her, after she had explained everything. Not the date it was notarized. The date it was executed. Why? Because if your grandmother had a stroke in August, and this document claims she signed it in September, then either she signed it or she didn't. And if she didn't, the date is your opening. Zola wrote the word date in the center of a blank page and circled it 3 times. Then she went to work. The courtroom was smaller than she'd expected. She had been in operations rooms. She had been in command briefings where the wrong call meant soldiers in the wrong position. She understood pressure. But there was something particular about a courtroom. The wood, the formality, the way everyone moved as if they had memorized their roles, that had a weight to it she hadn't anticipated. The judge was the Honorable Matthew Greer, a man in his late 50s with half-moon glasses, and the expression of someone who had heard everything and been impressed by very little. When Zola stood and stated her name and her status, Zola Adeyinka, self-represented respondent, appearing on behalf of my grandmother Mavis Adeyinka, he looked at her the way you look at something unexpected in your peripheral vision. Not hostile, just assessing. Judith Bale, for the applicant, presented first. She was polished and efficient. She entered the agreement of purchase and sale. She entered the transfer of title. She entered the notarized registration. She walked through the timeline with the smoothness of someone who had rehearsed it until it felt like breathing. The documents looked real. They were formatted correctly. They had stamps. They had signatures. That was exactly what Zola had been counting on. When Bale finished, Greer looked over his glasses at the respondent's table. "Miss Adeyinka, you may respond." Zola stood. She didn't rush. She had learned, in the forces, that the fastest thing you could do was move at the right speed. "Your Honor," she said, "I would like to enter several documents into evidence, and then I'd like to ask the applicant's witness one question." Greer raised an eyebrow. "One question." "Yes, Your Honor." She heard someone in the gallery make a sound that might have been a laugh. She didn't look. She kept her eyes on the judge. "Very well," Greer said, with a tone that was somewhere between amused and skeptical. "Proceed." The documents she entered were not what anyone expected. The first was Mavis Adeyinka's medical file from August of the previous year. Specifically, the admission record from Brampton Civic Hospital, documenting her stroke on August 11th, and the occupational therapy notes from the following 3 weeks, documenting the significant tremor in her left hand and her reduced fine motor control. The second document was a letter from the same occupational therapist, dated September 3rd, stating clearly that as of that date, Mavis's signature was inconsistent and that the therapist had specifically advised her patient not to sign any legal documents until the tremor resolved. Bale objected immediately. "Your Honor, the relevance of the applicant's medical history to a straightforward property transfer." "The relevance," Zola said, not raising her voice, is that the agreement of purchase and sale submitted by the applicant bears a signature dated September 7th. 3 years after my grandmother bought a house. 4 days after her occupational therapist told her not to sign anything. The room was quiet. Greer looked at the document in front of him. He looked at the medical record. He looked at the 2 dates. "Proceed," he said, and his voice had changed. The applicant's witness was a man named Stuart Carver, a notary public who had processed the transfer of title. He was in his early 50s, thin, with the particular discomfort of a man who had expected this to be a formality. Zola approached the witness stand with her folder. "Mr. Carver," she said, "you notarized the transfer of title for the property at Elm Ridge Crescent. Is that correct?" "It is." "And when you notarize a document, you're attesting that the person who signed it did so willingly, in your presence, and that the signature is genuine. That's correct. And you personally witnessed Mrs. Adeyinka sign this document?" Carver shifted slightly. "The notarization was completed in my office." Zola opened her folder. "Mr. Carver, my grandmother's left hand is her dominant hand, the one she writes with, the one she signs with. When she came to your office in September, did you notice any tremor in that hand?" Carver paused. It was a short pause, probably only 2 seconds. But in a courtroom, 2 seconds sounds like a very long time. He cleared his throat. "There may have been some minor. Did you ask her about it?" Did you ask her if she had any condition that might affect her ability to sign a legal document? Did you ask if she had seen a doctor recently? Did you, as the person legally responsible for certifying that signature, ask Mrs. Mavis Adeyinka if she was all right?" Carver looked at his hands. Zola let the room hear the silence. Then she said, "I only have one question for this witness, Your Honor, and here it is." She reached into her folder and withdrew a single sheet, a photocopy of the transfer of title signature, enlarged to full-page size, beside a photocopy of Mavis's hospital intake form from August, where she had signed her name in the admission paperwork. She placed both in front of the judge. "Mr. Carver, can you explain why the signature on the transfer of title does not match my grandmother's signature from 3 weeks earlier, including the tremor pattern, the letter formation, and the pressure distribution, and instead matches the signature style of a right-handed person?" The silence was different this time. Mavis Adeyinka was left-handed. She had been left-handed her entire life. The signature on the transfer of title was not. Greer called a recess. Zola sat beside her grandmother in the hallway outside courtroom 4 and didn't say anything for a while. Mavis had brought a small container of groundnut soup in her purse. She always carried food, a habit from years ago she had never dropped, and she offered Zola some, and Zola took it because it seemed like exactly the right thing to do in that moment. "You're not nervous," Mavis said. It wasn't quite a question. "I'm very nervous," Zola said. "I just look like this." Mavis made a small sound that was almost a laugh. When Greer reconvened, he was brief. He had reviewed the signature analysis and the medical documentation. He had noted that Bale had been unable to produce any evidence that Carver had conducted the standard capacity assessment required by Ontario notarial practice before processing a document of this nature. He had noted that the handedness discrepancy raised significant questions that had not been addressed. He adjourned the matter pending a full forensic document examination and referred the file to the Ontario Provincial Police's Financial Crimes Unit. Owen Prescott left the courtroom without looking at anyone. Here's what happened after. The forensic examination confirmed what Zola had already known. The signature on the transfer of title was not Mavis Adeyinka's. It had been created using a digital overlay technique, a method that produced a visually similar but structurally different signature, one that would have passed casual inspection but not careful analysis. The kind of analysis a signals intelligence specialist trained to find patterns in noise would catch immediately. Stuart Carver agreed to cooperate with the investigation. He had processed 11 documents for Prescott's various numbered companies over a 4-year period. He had been paid, each time in cash. Owen Prescott was charged with fraud over $5,000, forgery, and uttering forged documents. He was also charged in connection with 8 other property transfers in Peel Region and York Region. His lawyer was not Judith Bale. Judith Bale withdrew from the matter and issued a statement saying she had not been aware of the fraudulent nature of the documents, and the Law Society of Ontario opened a review. The house on Elm Ridge Crescent remained in the name of Mavis Adeyinka. Zola went back to work at the fitness facility in Mississauga the following Monday. She didn't own a suit that fit properly. The blazer went back to her cousin's closet, and she had taken 3 days off without pay for the hearing and the preparation. She ate lunch at the counter of a Tim Hortons on Hurontario, a double-double and a toasted bagel, and she looked out the window at the traffic and felt something she didn't have a word for. Not pride, exactly. Not relief. Something more like the quiet after a long job, when the task is done and the ground has stopped moving under your feet. A woman sitting 2 seats down had been watching her for a few minutes. Finally, she said, "You're the girl from the news." Zola looked at her. The woman had her phone out, showing a short clip from outside the courthouse. Someone had filmed it. The moment Zola and Mavis walked out, Mavis's hand tucked into the crook of Zola's arm, both of them squinting in the October light. It had been shared a few thousand times. "That's my grandmother's house," Zola said. The woman nodded slowly. "You're a lawyer?" "No. What are you?" Zola wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "I'm her granddaughter," she said. 3 months later, Ronald Briggs, the retired paralegal who had taken her call at 8 in the morning on a Friday, sent her a card in the mail. Inside, in neat block letters, he had written, "You found the thing that didn't fit. That's the whole job." She pinned it to the wall above her kitchen table. In the small apartment she was still furnishing, in the city where her grandmother still lived in the house on Elm Ridge, in the country where a 23-year-old woman with a borrowed blazer had walked into a courtroom and, with one question, made the silence do all the work. Some rooms don't need a lawyer. Some rooms just need someone who refuses to leave.